Hi y'all, I'm excited to be talking with you on this crisis communication module. You know, I have been studying crisis and disaster communication for most of my career. So let's go ahead and get things started by taking a look at our slides and learning how to differentiate between some of these very foundational definitions. So we'll start by what's the difference between a crisis and a disaster? Well, a crisis we can consider as kind of a breakdown in a system that creates shared stress. Super broad definition, right? Now, if we look under that a little more in detail, we see that disasters are related to crises. And disasters are usually considered events. They're sudden, they disrupt routines, and they require us to enact new actions to be able to move forward. Another type of crisis is called a public health crisis. And really this has been differentiated between an organizational crisis and a disaster because of COVID-19. And so one of the things about a public health crisis is they actually look a lot like a disaster and a crisis. And so they are a threat to public health, and they usually happen across a large geographic area. Now, you'll notice the next one, an organizational crisis, is in burnt orange, and that's for a reason. This is the bulk of what we'll be talking about in this class. That is defined as this perceived violation of stakeholder expectations that can create negative outcomes. So you notice that there are some key words in here like perception, because in an organizational crisis, sometimes it's perceived as a crisis, and because it's perceived by stakeholders, we have to respond. So let's dive in a little more deeply and learn about some of these differences. So we talked about disasters being events. They're usually large scale. And another thing that's really common with a disaster is we have a lot of different government agencies that are involved. And I'll give you an example. So I study flooding a lot. And so we'll see that the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Group, is associated with flooding disasters. You also start to see that emergency management coordinators in rural areas and in counties are also involved. And so you have lots of different government agencies that get involved. Now, this is really different from an organizational crisis. A lot of times this happens just to a single organization or a group of organizations that might be closely affiliated. And the organizations themselves are the ones who have to respond to disasters. Now, there are some times when an organizational crisis can create a disaster, but it's a lot more common that disasters also cause an organizational crisis. And the reason is that the organization has to deal with whatever kind of after effects that there are with a disaster. But let me spend a minute on this other direction of this arrow. And the example that I have here is there was a very large oil spill off the coast of Louisiana, and BP was the company that was involved in that oil spill. There's a lot of information out there on it. You're also going to find that your book talks about the BP oil spill a lot. I'll give a plug. There's a movie out there as well. The movie's pretty good. If you find this fascinating and you want to watch the movie, take a look at the movie. I'll probably be sure and tell you the name of it when we get to class. Okay, so you can start to see these relationships between disasters and organizational crises. Now, a lot of what we learned about crisis communication actually came from disaster and emergency management. One thing you're going to notice in this class is whenever we have our real world with Cindy and Rhonda, which I'll introduce to you, two crisis communicators, they actually use a lot of words that come from disaster and emergency management. So a few of those are preparedness, mitigation. They talk about responding to a disaster, and then they talk about the recovery phase of a disaster. They're also usually focused on the people that are affected. Now, organizational crises usually use slightly different words. What we talk about there is there's the pre-crisis, there's the crisis event, and then there's the post-crisis. Now, a few things that happen there, we're still doing prevention in our pre-crisis, but we're also in the post-crisis a lot of times having to manage the reputation of the organization. And we're also trying to demonstrate that if anything was the fault of the organization, how are they going to make sure that this is never going to happen again? And they're very focused on stakeholder perceptions. Now, if we take a look at different kinds of organizational crisis types, we see they fall into a couple of different categories. The first one is called an operational crisis. You might be surprised to know that most organizational crises we never even hear about. And the reason is that it disrupts the internal operations of that organization, but it doesn't necessarily need to get out in the public. The organization handles it. So if they had a fire or if they had, something that happened and only affected the organization, it would stay internal. Now, occasionally what will happen is you'll have product tampering or product harm kind of situations, and your book gives you great examples of these. Those are also considered operational crises, but they quite often have to be handled in front of the public. Some other things about operational crises that might be helpful are you need to keep your employees and a lot of times your suppliers informed. And there's a term called business continuity planning that is often associated with an operational crisis. It's very similar to crisis management, but it's really focused in on what might happen to us from an operational standpoint and how do we make sure that we do everything we can to avoid having those things happen. Now, the other type of organizational crisis, your book calls a paracrisis. And I'll tell you, in this class, you're going to find I'm very direct. And whenever I don't really see clear distinctions between terms, I'm going to tell you that, and it'll never show up on any type of a test. So a paracrisis to me, I actually see them pretty entwined with an operational crisis. However, there are a couple of key things here. And that is you've got to manage this crisis in the full view of the public and stakeholders. A lot of times reputation and social media is involved in a paracrisis. So for example, there might be an ad that a company puts out and it offends the stakeholders. That would fall into this paracrisis. And you can probably see how that's not necessarily an operational crisis, but it's something the company did. And now they've got to respond to it. The other thing is that managing it in front of the public is very important for these paracrises, because if you ignore it, public will, as you all have seen, they will cancel you and they will take it out on you. Now, I thought I'd also share with you some of my own research interests because you can start to see how these two entwine really well. I've studied the BP oil spill. I've also studied spokespeople's emotions and pet food recall crises. Now, those fall into the organizational crisis communication bucket. This next one is I've done a lot of disaster communication research as well. I studied Hurricane Harvey, for those of you who might be from the Houston area, or even really the United States. It's talked about a fair bit now. I've done a wildfire evacuation drill, which was super cool. This community outside of the Austin area got together and over 200 people evacuated their homes to practice what would happen if a fire came toward them. I've done work on flooding, a lot of work on flooding actually, extreme winter weather, and what you're going to see here is how closely they're related to an organizational crisis. So the example I'm going to share with you, I want to take you all back. I don't know how many of you have experienced power outages and water shortages whenever we have extreme cold weather. But in 2021, February, we had this very extreme cold event. Now, just because we might be kind of diverse in this class and coming from different places, I thought I would share with you some of the background behind why this is important. You're going to notice on my picture here that the Texas energy grid is completely separate from the rest of the United States. Gee, Texas might be full of a bunch of independent people. And I'm a native Texan, so I feel like I can kind of pick on us a little bit. But yes, we have a totally separate grid. We are not connected to the East Coast or the West Coast right now. So what happens is in the northern part of the U.S., in the Midwestern, is that the U.S. can handle cold weather. We're actually noticing now that they're struggling a bit with heat, but cold weather they can handle. Texas, on the other hand, we don't even have snowplows in the southern part of Texas, and we're certainly not used to seeing ice on trees that look like this, okay? Now, the reason why it matters that there's all this ice on these trees is imagine that power lines are under those trees. That is exactly what happened in the ice storm. They snapped. They snapped our power lines. And so all of these came together and had some pretty bad consequences. You know, some people were without power for a whole week. The weather was really cold. People were also without water for over a week. We saw under-resourced communities get hit the hardest. And whenever water freezes in your pipes because you don't have any heat to keep them warm, they burst and you end up with a flood in your home. You know, people couldn't drive on the icy roads and people ultimately died. So if we take a look at this, one of the things that I found really fascinating about studying this kind of disaster is that it showed how important it is for our fundamental infrastructure in our country to actually engage with communication researchers and practitioners. And the reason is that if you don't get people to trust you in these disasters, then they're not going to do things to help you resolve it. One group that got hit the hardest with this was utility companies. Now, these are your water and your power, and they kind of happen behind the scenes. They're not a group you pay a lot of attention to. And furthermore, they weren't very used to helping and communicating to the public on a regular basis. So they were not able to monitor social media at the rate they needed to. They couldn't provide this bidirectional trust-building communication, and they weren't providing adequate updates. In this way, the utility companies experienced an organizational crisis. So you're starting to see now how the organizational crisis and the disasters related. The disaster pretty much caused an organizational crisis here. The other communication challenges were that there was a lot of uncertainty because of these communication issues. And we were trying to get the public to conserve water and conserve power because so much was down. But when they're not getting good communication, they're not going to try to help with these types of very serious issues. So I also thought you might enjoy knowing a little bit about what communication tools were used during that. So in your book, you're going to learn about wireless emergency alert systems. The county had one of those, but they actually had no plan for how to send out messages. And this is Travis County in particular. The other thing is the city of Austin had what's called a public information officer. They actually had quite a few. You can consider them a lot like a crisis communicator, but public institutions a lot of times call them this, they call them a PIO for short. But the problem is a lot of them weren't trained in emergency response. And the utility companies used the local news and the weather personnel, which, by the way, local weather forecasters are historically some of the best communicators and people trust them. But there's a problem, right? If you don't have any power, you can't watch the news. And most of you watching and being a part of this class, you know, if you're under 30, sometimes under 40, you're not watching your local news, right? You're getting it on your phone and you're getting it through a curated feed. The other thing is that the energy companies had these outage maps, but they just couldn't keep up. And so I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that, and I think you'll appreciate this. First of all, the online energy apps, what they do is they show who has power and who doesn't, but they couldn't keep up with the number of people who didn't have power, and the end users got really, really frustrated. Take a look at this. This person is literally saying in a social media post that they felt like the map was gaslighting them because it wasn't acknowledging that they were out of power. And you can imagine being an energy company that's not used to handling these kind of tweets that are coming in at them. And they're frantically trying to get their app back up and going, showing power outages and kind of the frustration that everyone experienced. The Winter Storm Uri in particular, communication issues were listed as the top issue with most utility companies when they did what is called an after-action report. You're going to learn about those this semester as well. You'll hear them repeatedly. And then this is an example of how the water utility tried to communicate. And the message, I just find this, do this. We need you to immediately limit your water use. Oh, but the water is safe to drink. But now stop doing all this. Don't do this. There is this huge issue at our plant. When you get finished with a chaotic message like this that was obviously not templated, which is something we're also going to learn about this semester, is templating our crisis communication messages. Do you think anyone thought the water was safe to drink that read that? Absolutely not. It felt like a chaotic mess. The other thing that happened is they did have some nice posts in Spanish, but I want you to look at this. The message was designed in Spanish. Look at the graphic. Yeah. The instructions were provided in English. Once again, a lot of pre-planning for this type of disaster could help them avoid these kinds of their mistakes, but they're mistakes that they were trying their best. They were just in the middle of an incredible organizational crisis in the middle of a disaster. So if we come back to kind of situating our organizational crises, we now see that these disasters can actually be related to our organizational crises, and that sometimes the organizational crisis can cause a disaster. I really hope that you've all enjoyed learning about these differences between disasters and crises. And now that you know we're going to be focusing primarily on what's called an organizational crisis in this course, I think you're all going to walk out of here with some added knowledge about messaging, about how to communicate, how to think about stakeholders and who cares about these various messages. I look forward to continuing the semester with you, and I hope you've enjoyed today's overview of what is also in your book. Take care.